As you know, I'm a retired history professor, and a long and very agreeable career teaching, researching, publishing, but my field was Spanish history. That's where I did almost all my research. To be more specific, I dealt with the rural population of Spain, central Spain, part of Spain we call Castilla, or Castile, in the 1500s. I never did Texas history, and I never did Swedish colonies. And I probably never would have had it not been for the fact that in 1985, a state historical plaque was raised near where Stockholm, Texas used to be. When I heard of that, I wasn't there, but I read about it in the paper, and somebody told me about it also. I thought, you know, it would really be fun if I could write an article about Stockholm, Texas. And I hadn't seen any such thing. That was in 1985. But then I forgot about it because I had a plate full of other things to do. I was doing Spanish history, I was spending time in Spain, etc., etc. So I really didn't give my attention to Stockholm, Texas until I retired from teaching. That was in 1997. By then it was almost too late. By 1997, almost all the original pioneers had died, or if they were still living, their memory wasn't the way it used to be. It suffered my trouble with memory. Anyway, it's already been mentioned that my parents and my grandparents were members of the Stockholm, Texas community, so it was kind of a family thing for me to do it. Anyhow, when I decided that I would write this article, I found that the people I really should have interviewed were dead, or no longer were as sharp as they should have been. And very, very discouraging, I discovered that almost nothing had been published about Stockholm, Texas. But I did what I could. I figured, well, an article wouldn't be too difficult to research. I interviewed a couple of dozen surviving pioneers and their descendants. I found that the courthouse records in Raymondville and in Brownsville and in Edinburgh were very helpful. And after spending about 4 years in research, I looked at what I had and I discovered that there was more than I needed for a lot more than I needed for an article, that I could make a book out of it. And that's how the book really came to be. The book project, including not only research but also including trying to get it published, took 5 years. And I decided to name it Stockholm on the Rio Grande. You might have been struck by the title. Stockholm is not on the Rio Grande. It is a number of miles away from the Rio Grande, but when the Swedish colony was first formed, the Rio Grande flooded every time there was a big rain upriver, and Stockholm was flooded. I decided to call it Stockholm on the Rio Grande. I thought, well, people are going to find that interesting. You might want to read about what could have happened. Let me briefly summarize the history of Stockholm, Texas. Before the 20th century, almost all the lower Rio Grande Valley of Texas was ranch country. There was very little else economically going on. You had large ranches, very thinly populated with humans. Most of them were of Mexican background or were actually Mexicans who crossed the border, because back in those days, nobody paid much attention to whether you were legal or not legal. In any case, the ranches were mesquite thickets. You had thorny mesquites, you had cacti, you had other thorny bushes. In fact, some of the Swedes who came down to live in the area said every living thing in the natural vegetation has thorns. So the only ones that don't have thorns are the land agents. So they're pretty smooth. Anyhow, before the 20th century, nearly all the Rio Grande Valley was isolated from the rest of the country, the rest of the state. You couldn't get there except on unpaved and often ungraded roads. There were trails, basically, to get through the ranch country between Brownsville and Kingsville, or between Edinburgh and Alps. So the valley was isolated. It was hard to get there from the rest of the country, and it remained isolated until 1904, when the railroad reached Brownsville. That opened up the Lower Rio Grande Valley to development. You could get to the valley with the railroad, and you could get valley products using the railroad from the Lower Grande Valley to the rest of the country. Valley products were particularly cotton and citrus and winter vegetables. Once the railroad was down there, clever individuals realized that in a developing area like that, you could make a lot of money if you were smart. So a lot of folks looked at the situation. They discovered they could buy ranch country. You could buy entire ranches for as little as $1 an acre. They could subdivide those ranches and sell them for $30, $40, $50, $60, $75 an acre, depending on where they were. So a lot of money was being made, could be made. In 1912, a group of Swedes living in Minneapolis decided they would take advantage of the profit potentials of the valley. They bought a ranch called the Turner Tract, named after a former owner. It was over 12,000 acres in size. That's a large chunk of real estate. And they decided to transform those 12,000 acres into a Swedish colony. They advertised in Swedish newspapers all over the country and in Canada as well. And almost every part of North America that had any Swedes to speak of had a Swedish newspaper. It was probably only a monthly, or perhaps a weekly newspaper, but you could have ads. Circulated. You can see one of the ads that appears in the Texas Post. And he called Stockholm a Swedish colony. Not just a community, but a colony. Okay, very interesting.